So I know that people will be joining us as I'm making my remarks, but welcome everybody. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder and director of the Parent Education Series. I'm now in 4 school districts, including the Sequoia Union High School District, Las Lomitas Elementary School District, the Redwood City School District. Again, we are delighted to be with you, albeit online. We wish that we could be together, but again, we as the Parent Education Series made a quick pivot to offering online events, and it has been very successful to date. We're so glad to have with us today Tiffany Hoang, the co-founder of CircleUp Education. So let me tell you just a little bit about how today is going to go, and then I'll introduce Tiffany to you. First of all, again, welcome. I want to say a particular special thank you to the Sequoia Union High School District and the Sequoia Healthcare District, without whose support this program would not be possible. Again, all of the events that we have been offering lately, the webinars are available on our video library. We have a YouTube channel and a Vimeo channel, and those links will be in the chat today. So please have a look to get those links. We're really proud to have had more than 6,000 views of our videos in the last couple of years, including 2,000 since COVID-19 and school closures. So it's clear that you parents are benefiting and enjoying these videos. Today's format will be about 45 minutes with 30 minutes of content, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not chat, but in Q&A. I have a few questions from parents to get the conversation started. So again, as you're listening, if you have questions, please include them. Upcoming events, we have a couple spots left for Friday's new initiative, the Parent Forum, #2 with Dr. Aran McGann, sponsored by the Parent Ed Series and Sequoia Healthcare District. We're very excited, again, so a couple spots remain in that. You can register on our website, and that address is in the chat. So you will see our seq.org Parent Ed Series address. Also, next week, we are going to be offering a free live stream screening of the documentary film Angst, Raising Awareness Around Anxiety. So look for that in the newsletter. You will see an Eventbrite registration, and then the link will follow. So again, Angst all next week. You can watch it on your own time, okay? All right, let's get going. Tiffany Hoang is the co-founder of CircleUp Education, a social enterprise dedicated to providing diversity, equity, and conflict resolution training, coaching, and consulting services to cities, schools, businesses, and organizations across the Bay Area and beyond. Tiffany founded CircleUp Education at the age of 23, and since then she has become a noted diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer and consultant. CircleUp delivers impactful training services to cities, counties, public service organizations, schools, and academic institutions, as well as nonprofit and private institutions. Their satisfied clients include the City of Oakland, San Mateo County Office of Education, UC Berkeley, Stanford University, UCSF, San Carlos School District, and Portola Valley School District. She is a first-generation Vietnamese American and a graduate of UC Berkeley in Peace and Conflict Studies with an emphasis in conflict resolution. Tiffany and her co-founder, Tyrone Botello, continue to put their hearts and minds together to meet the needs of the people they serve while living out their mission of creating happy, thriving, and stress-free communities. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Tiffany Hoang. Take it away, Tiffany.
All right. Thank you, Charlene, and thank you everybody for logging on today and joining us for our presentation on diversity and bias in schools. As Charlene mentioned, my name is Tiffany. I'm the co-founder at CircleUp Education, and excited to be with you here today during these uncertain times to talk about something that is very certain and very, very wonderful, which is the diversity in our schools. And so a little background about myself before we get started. As Charlene mentioned, first generation Vietnamese American, grew up here in the Bay Area in Union City. And really how I got into this work around diversity was, I think being a first generation American really shaped who I am today. You know, growing up, my parents, being immigrants, had really strong cultural values for me of what it meant to be a good girl, which is, you know, you don't speak unless you're spoken to. Good girls should have long hair. They shouldn't have tattoos. And really just smiling and going along with the flow is really how you're going to be successful in the world. But growing up here in the US, the expectations and values are really different, right? It's all about how can you be different and unique and express yourself. And so those two cultural values really clashed within me, and how I was able to reconcile that or not growing up was I grew up really quiet, and I was shy, and I was timid, and honestly thought there was something wrong with me because I didn't know how to express myself, until moving on in life, realizing that there wasn't necessarily anything wrong. It was just differences in culture and values that I had in my family versus the world around me. And so that work really inspired me. And I think that experience really inspired me, that when I got to UC Berkeley and studied peace and conflict studies and specifically restorative practices, I realized that being able to find yourself and really understanding who you are can make all of the difference in the world. And the hypocrisy, I think, in growing up, you know, my parents, I saw directly how they would experience discrimination, being immigrants and having accents. And at the same time, they were a little bit racist also. You know, I used to watch Family Matters and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air going home after school, and anytime my dad would catch me watching those TV shows at home, he would be like, why are you watching TV shows with Black people? That's bad. And I was like, wait a minute, like, how does that make any sense? And so I say that because talking about diversity and bias and discrimination is really challenging, and it's very, very complex. And so I just want to start with that starting point today. And so in our webinar today, what I'd really like to do is give you an introduction to diversity, what it is, but more so, what are the challenges that arise in our schools because of our growing diverse populations, not only within our student population, but also our staff population. How does that come to a head, and how can we support our students, our schools, and even yourselves as parents and educators in creating a more inclusive environment? And so we're going to go ahead and get started now with our presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to talk to you a little bit about diversity. And so our presentation today is diversity and bias in schools. And we're going to go on a little abbreviated journey in this half hour that we have together, starting in talking about what is diversity, Diversity 101. We'll talk about stereotypes and explicit bias, how stereotypes can be conscious. We'll also talk about stereotypes and unintentional bias and discrimination, how sometimes we can be discriminatory but not even mean to. And then last, we'll do some closing with some closing tips and takeaways that you can use and think about as you leave our webinar today. So to begin with our first conversation, so you see here on the screen a little elephant hanging off of a branch here, and I bring up the elephant just to acknowledge that when we talk about the elephant in the room, usually what that means is that there's something really large, awkward, uncomfortable that everybody knows is there, but nobody wants to talk about. And I feel like when talking about diversity, the same thing happens. We see discrimination and inequities happening, but nobody is willing to talk about it. And it's usually because we don't know how, or we don't have the skills to, or we're afraid that we're going to be misunderstood or somebody might take it wrong. And so what is the elephant in our room today? The elephant in the room today that we're going to highlight is that today we're talking about discrimination and biases, and that's not an easy thing to do. And so in order to begin our learning journey, we just want to acknowledge that it's uncomfortable, it's awkward, but we want to lean into the sharp points, and we want to be brave together. And so we're going to start off this journey by developing a common language, because the more that we understand what each other are talking about in the moment, the less misunderstandings will occur. And so let's begin by talking about our aspects of diversity. What is diversity? So aspect one of diversity refers to differences, right? So the first aspect are external differences. So these are differences about a person that you can clearly see about them just by looking at them. So for example, this could be skin color, this could be hair type, this could be eyes or eye shape. Just imagine yourself imagining the schools that your students attend and looking out at the faces on the yard or in the classrooms and all of the differences that you can see. Those are the external differences. Aspect 2 relates to our hidden differences or invisible differences. So these are things like our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our race, our national origins, that we can't see about a person just by looking at them. So for myself, for instance, right, you can see that I have external diversity. I have short hair, I'm wearing a blue dress, I have a tattoo on my arm, I have sort of a soft voice, I've been told. And what you don't know about me of my hidden diversity is that I'm Vietnamese and also Chinese. I am a business owner. Started CircleUp Education, didn't have any type of business experience, just knew that I love the work that I did. I am also a certified yoga instructor, and 5 days out of the week, I'm vegan. And 2 out of the other days, I eat meat. That's for another conversation. But these are examples of our external or hidden diversity. But today we're not just here to talk about our differences, right? Because after a certain amount of time, I think when we think about our kids, you know, when they're really young, from ages kindergarten to 3rd grade, pointing out those differences is really easy. Like, oh, mommy and daddy, look, why does that person in the wheelchair? Or why is that person bigger than we are? Or why does that girl have short hair? I thought girls are supposed to have long hair, right? They're really easy and able to talk about these differences. But after a certain age, we learn that talking about these differences are really, really taboo. And so we're going to talk about some of these challenges today, in addition to the ones that I just mentioned. So the third aspect of diversity relates to associations that are made between these differences. So the associations that are made between different attributes and characteristics, like our skin color or our age, and we begin to attach those things with positive or negative assumptions that are learned from different institutions. And what I mean by that is, as we go through about our go through our life, we begin to learn what's okay to say or not okay to say, and we begin to learn different characteristics about certain traits and identities, and we learn them through our family, our media, on TV, and of course in school. So examples, right, of different types of associations that exist usually come in the form of stereotypes. And what is a stereotype? A stereotype is a widely held belief that everyone from a social group has the same behaviors or characteristics. Everybody from this specific gender, specific race, they all have this characteristic in common. So some examples of that could be all Asians are bad drivers, all African Americans eat fried chicken, all Latinos love Mexican food, or all white people can't dance. So if you notice, all of these statements begin with the word all, because these behaviors are applied to everybody from that group. And so the thing about stereotypes is that they're partly true and partly false, right? Some Asians are bad drivers, and some Asians are actually good drivers, like me. All African Americans eat fried chicken. Some African Americans are vegetarian. All Latinos love Mexican food. Well, this is like a double whammy because not all Latinos are Mexican, and there's a lot of other varieties of foods that they could like. And we say that all white people can't dance, but what about Justin Timberlake? And so these are just some examples, but imagine, I know on the screen you see adults here, but thinking about those stereotypes and how they impact students and your kids, right? All Asians are good at math. All African American kids are athletic. All Latino kids are good at soccer. All white kids come from good families. these stereotypes exist in our communities through the different beliefs, through the different associations and exposures that we've experienced in our communities and on the media and the books that we read or the magazines that we flip through. And so with these stereotypes, the first challenge that it creates in schools is it creates assumptions. I think about one of the school districts that we worked with. There was a teacher, and this commonly happens, there was a parent that came to us and they were really, really frustrated because in the school district, the majority of the population was Asian and Indian. And in that classroom, you know, the parent came to us after talking with the administrator because they were just really distressed because their student was really, really under a lot of stress. Because what was happening in the classroom was that the teacher was asking the student to help the other students in their class with their math homework. And this Indian student, you know, felt under a lot of stress because they're like, I'm not even good at this and I don't even know how to do it myself, yet my teacher is asking me to help, you know, my fellow classmate here, but I don't even know what I'm doing, but I guess I just have to figure it out and do it. And that was really challenging for them because they were on the brink of having a mental breakdown. But that teacher didn't realize that that's what was happening, that there was a stereotype that existed in that teacher's mind of, oh, this Asian student, they're working hard, they're trying, they must be really good at this. So I'm going to apply and impose this expectation or request without realizing that maybe this request is driven by a bias that I didn't see or a stereotype that I have. And so when we talk about stereotypes and diversity, this is the first challenge that comes up, which is the assumptions, the automatic assumptions that we experience that are created in our minds. The next challenge that exists is when we look at stereotypes, the challenges come in two forms. First, in the conscious realm and the unconscious realm. And so what you see here on the screen is what we call the axis of bias and discrimination. So stereotypes are an example of a bias, which is a thought, a beliefs, or values that we have. And these biases can be conscious, like I believe that all students are capable of being high achieving, but maybe I have an unconscious bias or belief that Asians are good at math and African American students aren't. And so when we say that it's unconscious, it means that I'm not ascribing to that belief, but based on what I've seen in the media, that might be living in my mind somewhere without me really saying or truly believing it, but it's there in my mind, hidden from view. And so our beliefs and our biases actually translate into discrimination. And discrimination is just a word for actions or behaviors, right? I know discrimination has a very stigmatized belief or value around it. But when we talk about how we operate as human beings is that our actions are based on beliefs that we have. And so when we talk about the axis of bias and discrimination, that we can have conscious beliefs that exert into our conscious behaviors, but what we're here to do today is also look at the ways in which the stereotypes or beliefs that we might also have unconscious ones that translate into unconscious forms of discrimination. And so I want to give us an example of how this shows up. So in our schools today, when we talk about conscious bias and conscious discrimination, this is when you think about bullying or teasing, or if you look at the high school level, it even starts to result into violence or fighting, right? In some of the schools that we work with, there's clear biases about Latino students. And then I hear about conflicts that I'm consulted to come in and help address where students are writing things on the desk like beaners or go back home or you're illegal aliens. Those are examples of conscious stereotypes that students have, maybe even adults have, that relate to discrimination. Like, I'm going to make you feel uncomfortable by writing these statements and behaviors on your desk so that you feel excluded. Most times, though, this is not what happens, although it exists. Usually what we have to talk about, and it's not commonly talked about, is this area down here, which is the unconscious biases and the unconscious forms of discrimination. Similar to the story that I shared about the teacher and the student with the math homework, this happens quite often. And what happens when a bias turns into an unconscious form of discrimination, when somebody isn't meaning to cause harm, yet because of the bias that they don't realize that they have, it comes out and manifests itself, is something called a microaggression. And so I want to share a little example of ways in which our biases can result into discrimination. And this can happen in a lot of different areas related to our differences, examples of our diversity, like we talked about, related to gender, related to race, related to sexual orientation. I myself experience a lot of unconscious discrimination related to my race and also my gender. I'll give you a quick example of what I have experienced and then share a little bit about what I've seen in schools. And so growing up, well, actually, let's start with the one in the schools. So in the schools, I was recently visiting a school. I was there to talk with one of the counselors and to meet with them to talk a little bit about the work and provide some coaching and support. And I remember I was walking into the school and I had to go in and I had to check in and show my name, and they had to print out my badge. And so the receptionist was helping me sign in, and I let her know that I was going to go to the counseling office, and she was like, "Do you know where the counseling office is?" And I was like, "Actually, no, I don't. It's my first time, visiting the counselors there." And she was like, "Okay, no worries. Like, I will take you to the office there, and I'll have a student take you there." And so after I signed in, she went to the corner of the room of the office, and there's two students sitting there. And the two students were TAs, the office assistants. And even though there was two, she went to one of them and she was like, "Hey, you look like you need some exercise. Why don't you walk this young lady over to the counseling office?" And so I was about probably, I don't know, in the corner of the room hearing that, and my jaw just dropped and I kind of froze because I realized what had happened, that this office aide, this adult didn't mean to cause harm, I don't think, but didn't realize that they had a bias because one student was clearly bigger than the other. And I think she was alluding to her size and her body weight, and just making a comment of like, "Oh, you need some exercise. Why don't you go walk this young lady to the counseling office," without realizing that there might have been a bias there and that statement might have caused some harm to that student. And so when I bring up this story, because I think that is some of the characteristics that we experience when we see the examples of unconscious forms of discrimination, that usually that person doesn't mean to cause harm. It's unconscious and unintentional. But even despite the intention, these unconscious forms of discrimination cause as much, or if not more, harm than the outright acts of stereotypes and prejudice. And so when I think about these examples, when I was checking in with the student who was walking me to the office, to see if that had landed on her, I wasn't quite sure how to address it, but I looked over and said, "Hey, how's it going? How's your day?" And she was all jolly and happy. And so I was like, maybe I shouldn't bring it up, but, it caused me to kind of think a little bit, do I bring it up? Do I say something, or do I not? And so the ways in which these unconscious forms of bias result in discrimination are a couple of ways. One is through microaggressions, unconscious forms of discrimination in the interpersonal interactions, but sometimes in schools they also result in something much greater, which is institutionalized bias and discrimination, when we see the inequities that are occurring in our communities, such as something called disproportionate discipline, where students of color are being disciplined much higher, at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And we ask ourselves, why is that occurring? And I remember, and I think what happens is that without realizing, as educators, as parents, we might have biases that we're imposing that we don't even see. And I remember I was with my colleague, Tyrone, one day in a meeting at a school district where they were putting together their plans around how to address this issue of disproportionate discipline, because they had a really high amount of African-American students who were being disciplined, and they're like, we need to address this. And so we walked in the room and they saw us and they're like, oh, the CircleUp people are here, like, let's share with them our plans. And they started talking and they shared all these ideas of they were going to put into place some programs, extracurricular activities, different types of enrichment for African-American students who were being suspended at a very high rate. And I remember at that moment, Tyrone and I looked at each other like, wait a minute, like, something's not right here. And we asked the question, we were like, well, who are the ones, so these students are experiencing disproportionate discipline, but who are the people who are disproportionately disciplining those students? And I remember the educators then looked at us, and one brave soul raised their hand and they're like, well, it's us. And we were just like, yeah. And so I think what happened in that moment is, this outcome we see, we think we address it one way, but really the solution is looking at our own biases, because without realizing it, we might have labels and stereotypes about African-American students, for instance, that they are disruptive or loud or disrespectful, and that in interpreting their behaviors in that way can result us to removing them from the classroom and a conflict occurs, instead of asking ourselves, what are they trying to communicate right now? What's really going on? And so when you see that disproportionate discipline happening, that's an example of inequities that exist. Because that impacts their education, that impacts how much they're able to be in school and how they feel when they arrive in school. And so these are just some examples around how bias shows up in schools, and also discrimination. And so when parents and educators ask me, well, what can we do to address the forms of discrimination and bias that occurs, I think there's a couple of things that we can think about. The first thing, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So a few things to think about as we wrap up our conversation around what is diversity, stereotypes, and the ways in which it results into unconscious discrimination, and also institutionalized discrimination and microaggressions. Is one, we want to be able to challenge stereotypes when you hear them. So when your kids might have them, or your own. Because they easily come out, right? Like, oh, you shouldn't have short hair, you're a girl. Like, I hear that all the time from my mom. And I have to challenge that, right? Because if I don't, then they're going to continue believing that. And the students might go out into their communities and replicate those beliefs. The second tool is promoting a sense of curiosity and pride for students' diverse identities. So this part is really, really important, because for students and who experience biases and stereotypes, and quite honestly, that's all students, right? Because there's stereotypes about all aspects of our identities, is that if we don't acknowledge that can relate to internalized bias and shame. Like, oh, there's something wrong with me because I'm quiet. Oh, there's something wrong with me because I have tattoos and tattoos are bad. Or there's something wrong with me because my parents have accents. And instead of ignoring our differences or pretending like they're not there, one of the best things that we can do is promote a sense of curiosity and pride of our differences. And this starts you know, at elementary school, but it's important all the way through. Because if students are experiencing, you know, any type of exclusion or discrimination in their school communities, we want to be able to undo that and let them know that those things aren't true. And then the last thing is help your kids become aware of what they might face. And I bring this up because we have to first, in order to address bias, we have to first acknowledge that it exists. You know, being a young entrepreneur and business owner, I was, you know, as Charlene mentioned, I was 23 when we started CircleUp, and I experienced a lot of bias and discrimination, not only about my race, but also about my age. A lot of people underestimating me and seeing that, like, oh, well, she must be the intern or the secretary. She's not experienced. She's younger than all of us in this room. What does she know? And nobody prepared me for that. You know, I didn't know, like, that's what I was going to experience. And it took me some time to realize that that wasn't me and those things weren't true. And so doing your best to prepare your students for what they might experience could help them go a long way. And so I just want to leave it there because I know there's so much more to talk about and time flies. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and allow you all to ask any types of questions. After our Diversity 101 today, we kind of went shallow and then super deep. So looking forward to hearing your questions and talking more.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I think you really did an amazing job opening our eyes to some both conscious and unconscious biases and prejudices and stereotypes that we might hold and ways that we can help address those situations with our students. As you say, it's easy when the kids are young because we've all been in line at the grocery store with the child who says, why does that guy have such crazy hair? So that it's easier when they're 4 than when they're 14, but the conversation is still really important. So attendees, if you have any questions for Tiffany, don't be shy. Please type them in to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. But in the meantime, I have some questions that came in earlier for parents. So let's get started, Tiffany. We have a few minutes. Okay, most recently, the Sequoia Union High School District Board voted to go past no credit this semester because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some felt that this decision lowered the bar for our most at-risk students, while others felt that it was the only way to go given equity issues. What is your input on that?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. I feel like a lot of schools and educators are questioning now, and it really brings up a lot in terms of our biases and our understandings around equity. And I think the first thing is when we talk about equity is all about starting points, right? Is that the idea is that we want everybody to be successful, but equity means that we acknowledge that there's barriers to success, like tech challenges and issues, and even beyond tech is, you know, socioeconomic status, which is huge in our community, you know, and employment and family dynamics that come into play also. And I think with grading, it's hard because I think we want to have high standards for our students, but after a certain point when we're in a pandemic and a crisis, there's only so much we can control in terms of their environment. You know, in schools, we can provide them with the resources, we can provide them with the skills and the support. When we're not in that school environment, we can't, and it's a variable that we don't have control over. And so I think in this situation that, you know, I don't think I've fully formulated it myself, but I think we have to think in terms of the short term and the long term of what the impacts of the pass, no pass is going to have, and how can we benefit the most students and the students who are most at risk, who are facing the most barriers. Because, you know, I think about myself, like if I were in that situation and being pass, no pass, like maybe I'll be bummed that I just have a pass and not an A, but I'm going to have a far easier time making up for that in the future compared to some of my colleagues who I know who when they were younger, they were in foster care. You know, they were in multiple homes, they were homeless, and having to go about in a different system where, you know, I'm just going to have a failing grade, it's going to be much harder for them to get to where they want to go.
Thank you. Well said, Tiffany. I think that you made such a good point there about equity is really about the starting point. And we know in our communities and districts in the Bay Area that we come from very different starting points. So thank you. That's a really good point. And that brings me to another question from a parent that I think is on everybody's mind. I don't expect you to have the answer, but perhaps some suggestions for people. How can parents introduce conversations about diversity and equity? I'm afraid that I might transmit my own unconscious biases when I talk about these issues with my kids, although I think they're interested.
So I would say the first thing of how to introduce the conversation, right, because that's the question. I think it's first giving permission to talk about it. And so, I think it's a scary topic, and I think the last thing that students want to do is talk to their parents about it. So I think it begins with probably as a parent, starting that conversation of, hey, I know this is a thing. Maybe I just went to a webinar, I learned about this. I know that it's a challenge or issue, or there's a lot going on in your school related to it. I just want to let you know that it's okay to talk about it, and we should talk about it. And when it comes to, I think, building relationships with our kids, and I share this all the time with the educators that we work with, it's really about being vulnerable and sharing our own stories and perspectives, right? Because your kids have a bias about you. Like, you're their parent, you tell them what to do, you tell them to do their chores, you discipline them. And I think for them to be able to hear from your experience of where you experienced discrimination and where you've struggled could really open their eyes to not only seeing you as a parent as a full person, but also insight of what they might be experiencing also in a similar or different view. And you're then building allyship in that matter. And if you're afraid of talking about it in the wrong way, I think that's just the reality of it. There's no, it's gonna be, it's gonna be chunky, it's gonna be awkward. But if you ever need support, Google is your best friend if you ever want to check out facts, or you can email me. But it's not always a graceful, smooth conversation. And I think if you lean into it, knowing that you might make mistakes, at least it's a starting point.
I think that's really great, Tiffany. It's going to lead to our next question. I was thinking about all the things that you've said. You've really used your own personal story to highlight the work, and that means a lot to me. I'm actually half Canadian. My mother was an immigrant, and so we grew up sitting on Chesterfields and eating crumpets, so people thought we were weird in Palo Alto, but I get it. Storytelling is very powerful. Here's a really good question from one of our viewers. Is it a good idea to acknowledge the bias that leads to a stereotype, or is it better to deny it even exists?
That's a great question. It is absolutely better to acknowledge that it exists. Because if we don't acknowledge it, then we can't do anything about it, right? And we want to acknowledge the stereotype because that reveals to us our own starting point and what we've learned. So an example of that, right, is I told you I used to be a yoga instructor, and I was teaching at a gym in Hayward. And I remember, in Hayward, the majority of the population is Latino or Latinx. And I remember going and walking into that particular class, and there was lots of parents in there, or families or adults who were Latino. And there was a group of women and who were, with each other. And I remember preparing for the class. I was going to the bathroom before class started, and I was like, I wonder if I should try speaking Spanish in my class today to make it more inclusive and to help them out, And I was like, well, never mind. Maybe I shouldn't do that because I'm just going to maybe act a fool because my Spanish isn't that good. However, I lucked out because after that class, I went up to one of the women and I was like, hey, how was the class for you? And she was like, oh my gosh, I loved it. The downward dog, the sequence was amazing. And in that moment, I was like, wow, I realized I had a bias. My bias was that they didn't speak English, or that they wouldn't understand, the poses and the statements I was saying because maybe Spanish is their first language. And so I acknowledged that I had that bias there. And so now that I know that it exists, I can decide that I'm not going to take action on it in the future.
That is really important. So you really want us to call out the elephant in the room, it sounds like.
Yeah, call it out, acknowledge it. To do this work is really about humility.
Oh, that's a beautiful statement. We're going to remember that one, Tiffany. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. This is a true story. It comes from students in the Sequoia Union High School District. Here's a parent who writes, my daughter is part of a group of students working to increase diversity at Carlmont High School, the district's least diverse school. Students are unequally distributed at this point due to some districting concerns, with more students of color at Sequoia, Woodside, and Menlo Atherton than at Carlmont. The student feels that it's important to try, though. Do you have any advice for her?
So they're trying to increase diversity in their school.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, Tiffany, and it may have to do with what schools students choose to attend, public versus charter versus private. But just if you would speak to what a student who's doing this work, where they might, what would be some good resources, and where might they start thinking about this?
Yeah, so the first place that my mind goes is, why is there a lack of diversity? So my recommendation to the student would to do some research or do some exploration around the causes of the lack of diversity there, because there could be a lot of reasons, right? And we don't want to go into some type of solution before we understand the problem. So is it because of the perceptions that exist about the school? Oh, students of color aren't going there because they don't feel included, or it's not for them? Is it because of some type of policies or parameters around districting and where the students attend? Is it because of other policies in place or attitudes within the school community that's maybe excluding students of color? And so that's where I would start, you know, in thinking about how to increase diversity, is why is there a lack of diversity to begin with? And that will probably lead to a better answer than I can just off the top of my head.
Okay, then just one last question came in quickly. I'd love to honor it because I think that this is one you can really speak to. How do we break that habit of letting our bias, unconscious or not, sometimes rule our actions?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. This is like it's $1 million one, right?
Yes, it is.
So I want you to imagine in how do we break this habit? So in our minds, the way that our biases work is that they're like trenches in our brains, because we've learned from a young age that girl equals mother or nurturer, boy equals leader or boss or CEO, and that message gets reinforced over and over again when we watch TV or, you know, everything that we're exposed to. And so they become trenches in our minds. And so without even realizing, we fall into that habit or that trench. And how we break that is really, one, like Carrie asked earlier, is to acknowledge that the bias exists. Second is to put our brains from automatic mode into manual mode. Because we're moving all the time, we're on our to-do list, we have to think about what the kids are gonna eat, you know, what's their next class they have to log on to. And so we're operating from this like really quick automatic mode, which is where our biases are in the unconscious. And so in order to really break that habit, we have to move from automatic into manual mode, which requires that we slow down, we are curious, and most importantly, acknowledge that we might have biases that we're not aware of. And so I like to treat it like a game, you know, like going out, what biases can I find? What decisions might I make, and where do those decisions come from? And really challenging yourself to just monitor your thoughts and your biases where there might be coming out.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. You know, you brought up so many important issues today. Again, this video will be recorded and available for, thank you, CircleUp, for allowing us to show this video for about a month to parents. And I think that you brought up a lot of very important issues that we can bring up with our own kids, whether at the dinner table or in the car or whenever. That really, it pays to talk about it. And this program is all about communicating with your child or teen. So thanks to Tiffany, you've got some questions to go home or stay home and ask your kids today. Again, thank you so much, Tiffany Hoang and CircleUp Education. We look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. Take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Charlene.
Thank you, Tiffany.